The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Immigration, and particularly illegal immigration, remain one of the most divisive issues for our country today. Immigrants have historically and even today are still making an enormous economic contribution to our country. Is there a way that we can create a system for immigration that can ensure that we can enjoy these economic contributions but not have them offset by immigrants' use of government services or other externalities like crime? It turns out that a nation's visa program from our nation's past might offer some guidance for these policy choices today. Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about what the research by economists shows regarding government spending and the crime impacts of immigration is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Dan Smith, who's the Associate Director of the Johnson Center. Welcome back to the show, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. It's always a pleasure to be back on.
So let's start by, a while back we had one show on immigration where we talked about some of the economic benefits from immigration. And they're quite substantial, right? Especially in cases where there's a demand amongst U.S. employers for certain type of labor that can't be met by the U.S. labor force, right?
Absolutely. What we talked about on that show was that immigrants come to the United States to work, tend to provide massive benefits especially for the employers hiring them. They can't find the Americans to do either the low-skilled work or the high-skilled work. Mm-hmm. So bringing in these immigrants with those types of skill sets complements our labor force and makes America more productive overall.
And allows the owners of these businesses, whether they be farms or tech companies in Silicon Valley, to be more productive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've certainly seen examples where when immigration has been cut off or curtailed, we've seen cases where tomatoes or other types of crops, lettuce in Arizona, have gone unpicked, and that's obviously a huge harm to American farmers. We've definitely seen prices and waits for surgeons and other high-skilled laborers increase because we haven't had access to as many of those people. So when immigrants come here and with those skill sets, engineers, doctors, they complement the American workforce and provide more choices and in general help American consumers.
And if we tried to restrict immigration and say whether it be farms or engineering firms in the United States couldn't get the types of labor that they need at the wages that they're used to paying, I mean, that might end up driving some of these businesses overseas, right?
Absolutely, and that's one of the unfortunate side effects of very strict immigration policies is that American manufacturers, if they cannot get the labor here in America to do that work, or farmers, they're gonna set up shop in other countries, and we lose out on the taxes paid by those corporations. We lose out on the expenditures made by the workers. The workers in those overseas factories don't pay taxes to the United States, so we lose out on a lot of benefits that we could realize here in the United States if we had a more fluid immigration program.
And I guess we'd also lose out on agriculture because we have a lot of land that's good for growing tomatoes or grapefruit mm-hmm. or oranges, and that land wouldn't be able to be cultivated in its most productive use if we can't access the labor necessary, right?
Yeah, we have a lot of potentially very valuable resources that would not be utilized if, in fact, these farmers or these companies shift their production overseas or the farming overseas. So you use that, but you also utilize people, right? Because if a physician is able to hire out yard work for his firm, that frees up money to hire maybe a secretary or another American skilled worker. So by hiring an immigrant, it actually lowers costs for the firm and enables them to hire more middle skilled Americans.
Now, and some people fear that if we have too many immigrants coming across to work or coming into this country to work, that there wouldn't be enough jobs for Americans. And so Americans would end up being unemployed or unable to find work because there'd be too many jobs going to immigrants. Does that make any sense from an economic standpoint?
Yeah, this is a common misconception, but when you look at the evidence, it is untrue. You don't find evidence to support it. And the reason for that is that and I'm going to use a technical term and then explain it, the elasticity of labor demand is fairly low. So it's very elastic in terms that as we get more workers, we're able to expand the number of jobs. Mm-hmm. And that's because the simple fact is that we all want a lot of goods and services, unlimited, and the more people that we have to work to provide those, the more of those goods and services we're going to purchase. And you can look throughout the U.S. history. As the labor force has expanded, especially with women entering the workforce and as population has expanded, we haven't seen a massive rise in unemployment. And that's because labor demand is very elastic, and as we have more workers able to work, we found ways to productively employ them.
And especially over time, as we can invest and have new factories or so forth, there's really no limit in the number of jobs that our economy could create.
Yeah, and then there's also another factor going on in that immigrants that come here can also be job creators. Mm-hmm. And as we talked about before, you can think of the obvious examples like the founders of Google or Steve Jobs at Apple. These are immigrants that have come here and created thousands upon thousands of jobs for Americans.
So immigrants are definitely making an important economic contribution. Now, we want to get into the topic we want to talk about today, and to do this, I sort of maybe want to play devil's advocate here for a second, or go into to think about immigration in the past. So if we say America is a nation that was built by immigrants, and it certainly was true, and back in the 1800s when people were coming to Ellis Island, passing the Statue of Liberty, coming to the United States, they were coming here to work because America was a nation that had a tremendous economic freedom, and we didn't have welfare programs back in the 1800s. So if you were a European and think about coming to the United States, it was a land of opportunity where you could go and work for, you have freedom to go and apply your talents and skills, and there weren't going to be a lot of handouts available from the government anyway. So if you decided to make that long and perilous and costly journey to America, it was probably because you were coming here to work. Now, today is very different. Our government provides a whole range of services, from welfare and food stamps and Medicaid for lower income Americans to public schools. We have this government spending at all levels of government is over a third of our GDP. And so with government spending so much, isn't there a danger now that immigrants, even though they are still doing a lot of economic value, providing a lot of economic value, that they might end up costing us from the government standpoint, when we think of the government services we have to provide to them, more than they're contributing in taxes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a really important argument to address because it's one of the primary criticisms of an open immigration policy. So it's very careful to analyze what type of government programs we're talking about. Are they welfare programs, or are they transfer programs that go from old people to young people to old people? So when it comes to America's case, I think we'll get into the specifics of this, but it's quite clear that immigrants are primarily coming here to work, and that they provide a positive impact on the economy. And while you can certainly think of anecdotal stories of an immigrant family that may be on welfare here or there, the vast majority of them are young workers that are coming here to find gainful employment. And furthermore, if you're concerned about immigrants living off of the welfare system, for an economist, I think it's not just immigrants living off the welfare system and abusing it that we're worried about. It's anyone that's going to live off the welfare system and abuse it. So rather than immigration being a legitimate indictment rather than welfare state being an indictment of immigration policy, this is an indictment of the welfare system itself, and that there's a lot of Americans that are abusing the welfare system that we should be concerned about, and that possibility of we have to look into ways to reform the welfare system so people aren't abusing it. And that's what we should be focusing our attention on, rather than the possibility of immigrants coming here and using that, abusing the welfare program.
But economists sort of like who've been studying international trade have come up with the term fiscal externalities or fiscal impact to refer to this, right? So could you explain a little bit what we mean by this idea of fiscal impact?
Yeah, so all this is looking at the ledger and saying, okay, when an immigrant comes here, statistically speaking, on average, are they likely to be gainfully employed? Are they likely to live off the welfare system? It's looking up at all these costs and benefits. So certainly there are things where immigrants tend to utilize things like roads, public education, and we'll get into this, where they do propose a cost to America. But there's also on the other side where they do pay in, especially both illegal and legal immigrants pay into the tax system, and we could find ways in which they contribute to the fiscal solvency, and especially I think in terms of our transfer programs that transfer like from young to old, such as Social Security and Medicare. Both of these programs aren't programs that transfer from the wealthy to the poor. They transfer from young to old. And so one of the only ways to actually solve our fiscal problems here in the United States in terms of Social Security and Medicare, which are massive liabilities that we have not funded and are going to come due, is by attracting more young workers that can pay into the system and restore fiscal balance.
So let's get into this point there, because you raised an important point, one that people might be unsure of, or it might seem controversial to a lot of our viewers, and it's the whole question of whether immigrants, and especially illegal immigrants, pay any taxes or not. Mm-hmm. And it turns out, you have to think a little bit about how it is that people are working off the books, or undocumented workers are working. But it turns out that they are often paying a lot of taxes, right?
Correct. And obviously, if you're a legal worker coming here, you're gonna be documented. You're gonna be, issued a Social Security number, and you're gonna be contributing in through your employment taxes and all the other taxes, consumption taxes, and the like. Illegal immigrants, people are often surprised by this, also end up paying taxes, and that's because they oftentimes craft a fake Social Security number in order to work. Mm-hmm. So they're coming here to work, and in order to work, they have to find a fake Social Security number, end up paying taxes. But on the flip side, when they go to try to get benefits, that fake Social Security number won't allow them to get those benefits. So while they pay into the system, oftentimes they aren't able to draw out from the system.
Or they don't end up living and working here long enough to ever collect Social mm-hmm. Security. But there is an important point, because there are Social Security taxes often being taken out of the wages being paid to many undocumented workers, mm-hmm. even though they aren't legally in there as like Social Security payees and then eventually recipients, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, incorrect. And I think it's really important to stress that point, that a lot of times, and we'll talk about some of these guest worker programs in a bit, but a lot of times these workers come here for a little bit, they want to work, and then they're going to go back mm-hmm. to their home country. And one possible unintended consequence of building a wall, as is currently being proposed, is that immigrants that come here, rather than going back after working while their labor is needed, are more likely to stay here for extended periods, even when labor demand decreases. And that's because they have a wall to get back across, and then if they cross back, they have to get past the wall mm-hmm. again. So it may make sense for them to stay here once they're here, even if they're here illegally.
And even undocumented or illegal workers, when they're here, they're going to go to stores and buy groceries and so forth, and they're paying sales tax then, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, and that's the primary way that they do contribute in taxes, is they're consuming goods, especially in states where that rely heavily on a consumption tax. In mm-hmm. fact, I think this is a good argument for, in addition to many other good arguments, for moving to a consumption tax rather than an income tax.
So now there's another side of what you were mentioning, and that is the whole the case of immigrants drawing welfare or being on welfare programs, and that also is largely a myth as well. I mean, simply if you just look at the legalities of who's eligible for welfare in this country, right?
Yeah. So when you look at the usage rates, yes, there are immigrants in the United States that come here, and after a 5-year period, they are eligible to receive welfare benefits, and there certainly are cases where that's happening. But the relevant factors compare it to the native usage. Mm-hmm. So are immigrants utilizing welfare to a greater extent than native-born Americans? And when you look at that evidence, it's crystal clear. No, a native-born American is more likely to be dependent upon the welfare state than a immigrant coming here. So on large, they're coming here to work more than our own native citizens.
So legal immigrants aren't eligible to collect welfare or various different welfare state payments for 5 years after they're here. How about illegal workers? Are they also eligible for welfare benefits?
As far as for means-tested welfare benefits, they are not eligible. An illegal immigrant is not eligible for those types of programs.
Now, how about then the children of immigrants, whether they be legal or illegal? Are they able to go to school, or are they able to collect other benefits?
Yeah, so the children of immigrant workers, whether they're born here in America and thus U.S. citizens, or they're brought along as dependents when they immigrate, they are eligible to go to public schools. And I think that is a substantial, there's certainly, that's probably the biggest expense imposed by immigrants on Americans, is that the cost of public education. And they're not massive compared to the benefits that these immigrants bring. In fact, I think the benefits outweigh the cost, but that there is a substantial cost in terms of that we're paying we're American taxpayers are paying for these schools, primarily through property taxes, and immigrants oftentimes who don't own property or maybe renting under the table are not contributing to these taxes to support the public schools that they send their children to.
But and then you also mentioned that the children of immigrants, whether they're legal or illegal, if they happen to be born here, they are indeed American citizens, right?
Yeah, no different than you or I. If they're born on American soil, the constitutional law on this is perfectly clear. They are United States citizens and entitled to all the benefits of being a United States citizen.
And that's one of the things that often makes the whole issue of trying to deport illegal immigrants a lot more complicated, because if the immigrants have been here for a while, and not only are they likely working and contributing, but they might have children who have been born here and now are legal U.S. citizens. So you think about, we can't actually deport a U.S. citizen. And so then you're talking about actually breaking up families, right?
Yeah, and that's definitely, there's a lot of philosophical concerns wrapped up in this. And importantly, I want to stress, so the reason why we fund public schools, at least the theoretical reason, is that funding those public schools is going to provide benefit. We're going to increase the value of those citizens by equipping them with the education that they need to succeed and be a productive member of society. If in fact immigrant children that are going through these public K-12 public education aren't receiving that, that's a problem with our public school system and not a problem with immigrants themselves.
Now, have any economists attempted to go ahead and actually calculate these fiscal impacts and see to what extent immigrants are constituting a net drag, or are they contributing to the fiscal health of our governments?
Yeah, there definitely have been economists that have dug into this, and it gets very complicated very quick, but the good economists are those that break it up into, are you looking at short term, are you looking at long term, are you looking at what type of educational level and skill set of immigration? And I think this source up here from Alex Northrush, how did you say that?
Alex.
We'll go with Alex. But he's a foremost, very prominent scholar known for doing research on immigration, and he's really carefully tried to add up in a very neutral way what are the realistic expected costs and benefits of immigration. And as you can see, it varies depending upon are looking at overall immigrants, or are you looking at the descendants of immigrants, and especially with the education level.
And then in these calculations, which this table ends up showing, the last line here where they talk about descendants, they're really talking about whether the descendants end up staying in this country and working, right?
Yeah, and if the descendants stay in this country and work, they provide a substantial net benefit, according to his calculations.
Yeah, and so that's what we're seeing here. So in one sense, you can sort of understand where some of this is coming from. If we're paying through the public schools to educate the children of immigrants while they're here, and then they don't stay here in this country to work, well, then they're never going to be paying back the taxes to, in effect, pay back that education. But that's sort of the same principle we're applying with our citizens, right? I mean, you and I, if we go to the public schools when we were growing up, we were consuming those government services until we entered the workforce and started paying taxes to actually make that up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I alluded to earlier, this could be an argument for privatizing schools, right? If this is if public education is the primary way in which immigrants impose costs on other Americans, well, if we privatize schools, that should reduce that type of problem.
Now, one thing that we can see is that there are often largely two sort of skill sets that immigrants are coming in. They're either like very well educated, the scientists and engineers, and then the lower skilled, lower educated, lower skilled workers who are working in agriculture or manufacturing jobs that a lot of Americans these days don't seem to want to work in. And with the highly educated immigrants, we don't have any problem with we're sort of our governments are benefiting from them, right?
Yeah, we reap substantial benefits in terms of the taxes they pay in, the jobs they create, their contribution to society in general. So their benefits are very clear.
And then when we come to the lower skilled or lower educated immigrants, there is sort of a trade-off here, as we can see that. I mean, for even the lowest educated immigrants, it basically ends up being a wash while they're here or during their lifetimes when we're educating their children. They might end up being a drain, but if those children stay here, they largely pay back through taxes what they would have gotten in the value of their schooling.
Yeah, if they integrate themselves into American society, they get their high school education, maybe even a college education, they buy a home, they create jobs, they're a productive member of the workforce, they end up paying back benefits. And you can think about this going back to any period, like when the Irish came or the Germans came, at different points in American history, the people that were currently there saw them as just an immediate threat to their employment opportunities and the wages, and they resisted them. But long term, you think about all the benefits, all the companies, all of the productivity that has been brought by these immigrants, it's massive in comparison to these initial costs.
And another thing to point out is that in these calculations here are simply looking at the government expenditures versus the government taxes collected. There are economic benefits that are being generated here, both to the immigrants themselves, because, I mean, if you're an immigrant from Guatemala or Central America here, you're likely sending money home to your family. You might be saving money to go back and start a business when you get back in your country. It could be life-saving savings. And then you're also generating benefits to the American companies that are employing these people, right? And that's not being captured in these calculations.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, is people may look at this and say, aha, that's a reason to curtail immigration, but this is just a strict calculation of the government accounting and does not include those important and massive economic benefits.
Now, if we are going to try to craft a visa program that's going to help us capture the economic benefits, but maybe avoid some of these government burdens to the extent that there are government burdens, we need to sort of think about different aspects of a visa program. And one element of a visa program that ends up being very important in terms of the design of it is whether the number of visas or the number of workers are going to be capped, or if it can adjust to the labor market demand. And why is that an important consideration?
Yeah, so in general, the tendency in America has been to put caps on it. So a cap on a certain number of people from this country, another cap on a certain number of people from this country. And this doesn't allow fluctuation in the number of people immigrating to the United States. So whenever labor demand surges or decreases, we're not able to readily adjust, except through the political system, which is always behind the mark and cannot fluidly keep up with labor demand. If you have a system that automatically responds up and down and allows more people whenever there's a need for labor and decrease when there's not, then you're going to alleviate some of these concerns while also allowing American businesses to get the labor that they need to stay in business and be productive.
So with the proper rules in place in terms of limiting, say, eligibility for government programs or background screening or whatever, with those proper rules in place, we should then let the market sort of determine demand. If companies in Silicon Valley need to hire a bunch more computer engineers, then let's let them hire them, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and that'd make America far more productive overall.
Now, there's actually a program in America's past that offers a nice possible way to construct a visa program that could still possibly work today, right? And it was called the Bracero Program. So if you could tell us a little bit about this program. Yeah,
so this program was implemented back, I believe, in the 1930s, 1940s. And it's essentially a guest worker program. Enabled people, especially from Mexico, to come to the United States and engage in agricultural labor. And they would be all set up ahead of time, where American companies would provide for the transportation cost and meet, minimum levels of sufficiency, like provide them with enough food, enough wages, everything like that. And then at the end, when the company no longer needed them, they'd be transported back back to Mexico.
And as you see, it was actually, I think it was started during World War II to meet some labor shortages on farms due to the massive amount of people we needed serving in the military. But it continued on for some number of years after World War II. And overall, 4.5 million people came to the U.S. under this system. And one thing I think was kind of interesting is that they, under this program, the immigrants weren't eligible to bring dependents with them, which would have addressed sort of like that most significant fiscal impact that we were seeing, especially with short-term workers, where if they're only coming for a short period of time, they're unlikely to stay permanently, and so therefore the children might not ever work in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think importantly, it also provided an incentive for them to go back. So they'd oftentimes leave their family, come to America for a brief period, work when we needed that work, and then they'd go back to their home country. Whereas a lot of times, if they come now illegally and bring their dependents, they're going to stay typically, even if that labor demand isn't there.
Now, there's one other issue that often comes up in discussions of immigration, especially illegal immigration, in light of President Trump's campaign during the last year, is the fear that immigrants are causing a lot of crime. And I don't know if it's just a matter of having watched Scarface too many times or too many movies like that. But what does the evidence show about immigrants and crime?
Yeah, so once again, I think that it's important to look at relative to natives. So yeah, you can look at crime statistics and stories of immigrants, and there's been some troubling cases where an immigrant has done some terrible things. But there's also been cases where native-born Americans have done equally terrible things. So we have to look at the statistics relative to each other, and when you do that, the vast majority of cases, you see much lower crime rates for immigrants coming here to work than you do for native-born Americans.
And if we do want to allow people to work in our economy, there's no reason to say we couldn't conduct background checks. There's no reason to let, say, members of the Russian mafia or Mexican drug gangs into the United States if they're coming here to cause us harm, as opposed to working and contributing to society. But to some extent, our extensive reliance on illegal immigration to meet our labor demand is making that impossible, right?
Yeah, it makes it very difficult to vet these people properly because there's such demand to get here from people that honestly want to work. If we changed our laws and made it easier for those people that want to come here to work to get here through properly vetted channels, through check them, then only the bad people are going to want to come here illegally, and it'd be much easier to allocate our enforcement against the few bad people rather than honest people that are trying to get here to work.
Yeah, as it stands now, it's almost like we're relying on these the smugglers or the coyotes who are smuggling people across the border to do our background checks for us, and I don't think that's what we need to or what we should be doing. So, well, we've come to the end of our time, so thanks very much for coming on and talk about this complicated and timely topic with us here today.
My pleasure.
And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.